Today we will travel to another dimension. A dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. You're moving into a land of both shadow and substance. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. There's a signpost up ahead. Your next stop? The Paperback Warrior Podcast.
Welcome, listeners, to the 74th episode of the Paperback Warrior Podcast. My name is Eric, and I'm joined today and every Monday by my co-host Tom. Paperback Warrior is a show about old paperbacks from the 20th century. We also have a blog at paperbackwarrior.com where we post daily reviews of vintage fiction with an emphasis on the men's adventure, crime, western, and spy genres, with lots of other genres sprinkled into the mix. We also invite you to join the conversation on our Facebook and Twitter pages. It's now time to say hello to the talented Tom.
Hello, Eric.
Man, last week you were talking about using all these voiceovers and things. Who were you, Rod Steiger there?
No, that was Rod Serling.
Oh, Rod Serling, that's right. Yeah.
I stole that from the Twilight Zone intro, one of my favorite shows when I was a kid.
Gotcha. Well, what are we talking about today?
Okay, so we have a blog, Eric, with over 1,000 reviews of vintage paperbacks and a wildly popular podcast among old men who get their internet via AOL dial-up. Do you regard yourself, Eric, as an expert in the world of vintage paperback fiction?
No, not by a long shot. I'm still learning so much about the paperback industry that existed 70 years ago, and there's so many classic books that I haven't read, and there's so many critically acclaimed authors that I have no experience with. Plus, I was a late bloomer to crime-noir, so that's my excuse.
All right. Well, it should come as no surprise to longtime listeners that I not only see myself as an expert in vintage paperback fiction, but I regard myself as the smartest man alive in this esoteric field. The problem is that being a genius of paperbacks isn't like being a genius in robotics or aerospace technology or theoretical physics. And by that, I mean knowing about old paperbacks isn't something I could ever leverage to meet girls.
Yeah, I'll grant you that. Yeah, definitely. But where are you going with this, man?
Okay, so my point is that even though we are recognized as a couple of Einsteins in this world, we both share a huge, honking blind spot in our vast paperback knowledge. And that, Eric, is vintage science fiction. We are a couple of morons when it comes to sci-fi.
Dude, it's definitely not my area of expertise. That's for sure.
Yeah, and although I haven't read much of it, I generally like science fiction. And over the past few months, I've dipped my toe into the science fiction waters, as have you. So I thought it might be fun this episode to share our thoughts about that. After all, you do not need to be an expert to read a book and say whether you liked it or not. If you're super hardcore into science fiction, this episode may be a frustrating listen for you. But please know that we are approaching this topic with great humility in an episode that we are calling Science Fiction for Dummies. But before we go to the stars, let's talk about some new book acquisitions. You good with that, Eric?
It's my favorite part of the show because there's a high probability that I'm going to receive a gift from you. So go for it.
All right. Well, I made another eBay purchase that I had forgotten I did until the book arrived in the mail a few days later.
Do we need to be concerned about these blackouts that you're having?
Now, see, if I was living in a crime novel from 1959, I would awaken from the blackout with a dead blonde in bed with me, and I would be forced to solve the case before the cops could bust me for the murder. In this case, I only wind up with an unexpected paperback. Moreover, my eBay shopping blackouts aren't caused by excessive boozing. It only happens when I surf around eBay while watching football on TV.
Fair enough.
Okay, so this week's surprise purchase, I'm going to hand this to you, is called Run Like a Thief by Michael Niall. It was released by Monarch Books in 1964, but it looks like it was originally copyright 1962. The cover art is by an artist named Stan Borak and depicts a woman's hand grabbing the wrist of a man's hand, which is holding a knife with a drop of blood on it. I think it's a simple but very compelling cover. What do you think of the cover?
It looks great. I really do like this.
Okay. So the plot is about a tenement building called the Barracks that's awaiting demolition. There's only 4 occupants remaining in this giant building. One of the occupants is a quiet and peaceful man. named Clem. Clem has a run-in with another resident, a teenage juvenile delinquent named Elena, who is associated with a violent knife-wielding gang. As that conflict between them escalates, an escaped murderer finds that the barracks is a perfect hideout from police. These people and factions in this giant slum apartment building find themselves in intertwining stories that leads to violence and a nightmare of terror. Now, Eric, if the name Michael Niall rings a bell with you, it's because that was the author's name on a Fawcett Gold Medal book that I read and reviewed last year called Bad Day at Black Rock. That was all tied into a movie starring Spencer Tracy. Michael Niall is the pseudonym of an author named Howard Breslin. Run Like a Thief is the only other book that Breslin wrote using the Michael Niall pseudonym. And it's clear that on the front, back, and inside cover of the paperback, Monarch Books is trying to capitalize on the success of Bad Day at Black Rock by linking the two books together under the pseudonym. Now, I was unable to verify it, but I think that Run Like a Thief originally came out in hardcover under Breslin's own name, and when it was time for the paperback release, Monarch Books slapped the Michael Niall pseudonym on it to steal some of the shine from Bad Day at Black Rock, because the movie had a couple Oscar nominations a few years before that. I don't think it worked out because I've never heard of Run Like a Thief until it mysteriously appeared in my mailbox following a blackout session of NFL game book shopping. There was a 1967 movie called Run Like a Thief, but I think it has a completely different plot. I mean, it's probably just a coincidence. In any case, I'm going to read that book, Run Like a Thief, by Michael Niall, sometime this decade, and when I do, I'm going to let you know what I think.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to that. Are you ready to get into the feature?
Only if you are ready to play the transition music. Okay, so before we start serving up our ill-informed opinions about old science fiction books, why don't you tell me, Eric, your history in the genre? Did you go through a science fiction book phase at any point in your life?
Here and there, I've tried to appreciate a good science fiction novel, and I can remember reading H.G. Wells' The Time Machine in my teens. And most recently, I read Arthur C. Clarke's, I guess you want to call it an alien invasion novel called Childhood's End. And I also really enjoyed Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. Reading 1,000 issues of X-Men is where most of my science fiction love comes from.
Yeah, it counts.
Yeah, those comics are like really cosmic with so many galaxies and time shift and things like that. But and I also read the occasional Star Wars novel. What about you?
So my gateway drug into science fiction was author Frederick Brown, and he remains a lifelong favorite author of mine. In 7th grade, I had a teacher named Mrs. Hennessy at St. Mary's Elementary School in Old Town Alexandria, Virginia. She did a lesson block. I still can't believe this occurred, but it did. I double-checked it with a buddy of mine. She did a lesson block on Frederick Brown in class, and we read several of his science fiction short stories. Now, his signature dish was short stories that were only 3 or 4 pages long and had twist endings. Frederick Brown's most popular story was called Arena, and when the original Star Trek did an episode that was pretty much the same story as Arena, Frederick Brown complained and received a retroactive writing credit on that Star Trek episode. It's a great story. You guys should somehow find the story Arena by Frederick Brown and check it out. Anyway, so this led to a love of science fiction short stories. I would hit used bookstores as a teenager and buy anthologies like Terry Carr's Best Science Fiction of 1982. And there was something about the genre, I think, that really lent itself to clever and speculative short stories. In high school and college, I actually worked at a science fiction and comic book bookstore called Tomorrow Books in Alexandria. But by that point, even though I was working at the store, I really took a liking to horror, crime, and men's adventure fiction. Anyway, so Tomorrow Books was the kind of used bookstore that had regulars who would hang out at the shop, and books were always being discussed there. And so it was through osmosis that I learned about and read some of my favorite science fiction books of all time. I read Frederick Brown's Martians Go Home, which I thought was hilarious. I also really loved a book by Robert A. Heinlein called The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. The gist of the book is that the moon becomes a penal colony a few generations earlier, and the current residents of the moon are the descendants of the criminals who had been sent there, kind of like Australia. Although these people have done nothing wrong, they're still treated as second-class citizens by the residents of Earth. It's basically the story of a revolution where the moon residents are seeking rights from a distant colonizing oppressor. I think Heinlein, I always called him Heinlein, was probably intending the book to be an allegory of some kind of the American Revolutionary War, where our rebellious colonies struck out against King George's oppression from afar. There's this really cool character who was a computer, somewhere between like Siri, Alexa, or Max Headroom, who's advising the rebels throughout the book. I probably read the book 33 years ago, and I got to say, Eric, it still stayed with me, and I think about it a lot, and our listeners should check it out. It's called The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Robert Heinlein. Now, my wife and I are suckers for time travel movies and books, and we had a husband-wife book club like 10 years ago. Reading a book at the same time was Heinlein's The Door into Summer. It was a very fun and clever time travel book, but I'd say it was light reading. No one would call that book Robert Heinlein's masterpiece. I also loved Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, but I could not get into the sequels. In my opinion, he should have probably just left it alone with the first book. I also tackled the first Dune book by Frank Herbert. It was awesome, but I have to say it was a very dense space opera with a lot going on. I definitely recommend it, but it's just a very big book with a lot of characters. You got to be in the right mood.
I think what I mentioned earlier with the Time Machine, Childhood's End, and Fahrenheit 451, as well as some of the ones that you mentioned, are perfect examples of me probably describing those books under a very general heading of science fiction. But science fiction is really just too broad of a term to use. It's like saying alternative music and heavy metal and rockabilly and punk are all just rock and roll. It's too broad of a classification. And you probably agree with me, there's a lot of subgenres of science fiction. A time travel story is going to be a lot different than, say, a space colonization story. Or one of my favorite subgenres, which is post-apocalyptic. It isn't the same as a dystopian work. They're similar, but they're different. My point is that each of these genres share the same space within the science fiction genre. Do you think that way too?
I mean, definitely. When I dip into science fiction, I like it to mostly be an earthbound adventure in a world recognizable to me, where science fiction-y stuff starts happening to the characters and the planet. When you get into the conflation of science fiction and fantasy and the two genres, they really couldn't be any more different from my perspective. I really have no interest in reading about dragons and fairies.
Here's what happens, though. When I go into the science fiction section of a bookstore, I normally find fantasy and the sword and sorcery kind of stuff there. And I mean, even stuff like Robert E. Howard's Conan books are normally lodged in the sci-fi section. Then I'm surrounded by not only Conan, but I get mired in the Warhammer novels and the Dragonlance series and R.A. Salvador, and I just get overwhelmed and I get really confused. Tom, I think my biggest issue with the genre is that I don't even know where to start.
I'd say there's probably two good ways to go about it. The first is the easy reading option. Find old pulp fiction, science fiction stories and novels, and just bask in the fun cheesiness of it all. And that's what I've been doing lately, and I'm going to share some of my reviews and impressions of these books later in the show. But I think a wiser choice, if you want to read like the great works of science fiction, is just to go to the experts. If you Google 100 best science fiction books of all time, you're going to find a lot of lists. National Public Radio polled 5,000 science fiction fans and created a list of the best 100 fantasy and science fiction books of all time. I think the list is garbage,
okay.
And I'm not going to dignify it with a discussion here on the show. But a much better list I found was on a website called Sci-Fi Lists, by a guy I don't even know named Peter Sykes. He reviewed 20 science fiction awards for the best books, reviews, and lists from 38 public critics, 17 polls of the public, and 53 other lists to compile what I think is probably the most sensible list of great science fiction works that I've ever seen. I'm not going to read you a list of 100 books because that would be mind-numbing, but I do want to talk a little bit about the top 10, and you could stop me if you have thoughts about these. Number 10 is Arthur C. Clarke's 2001 A Space Odyssey.
That movie put me into a coma.
I never saw it,
okay.
So but I imagine
Carry
the
on.
book is probably okay. Number 9 is Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. Trivia time, what movie is based on that book?
Blade Runner.
Blade Runner, exactly. Number 8 is Hyperion by Dan Simmons. You've read his horror books, right?
One of my favorite horror books ever is his 1991 book, Summer of Night. Have you ever read it?
No, I've not.
It's one of those small-town kids fight the small-town horror kind of thing, like Stephen King's It.
That sounds good.
It's great.
Yeah, he's good. I think he's one of those Mike Mormon guys who writes really big books really well. Number 7 is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. I was assigned that book in high school. It wasn't miserable, but it's definitely not worth your time. Number 6, Foundation by Isaac Asimov. Number 5, you mentioned this, Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Number 4, 1984 by George Orwell. I would maintain that one's more important because of its cultural significance, and we still use terms like Big Brother and describe things as Orwellian than the book itself. I didn't finish it. I have to admit that I was so abused by crappy books that I was forced to read in school that any decent book they recommended was immediately suspect.
Okay.
Number 3, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. That was a fun book. I almost think that was almost a send-up of the science fiction genre in many ways. Number 2, I mentioned that Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, and this guy's list has the number 1 science fiction book of all time, Dune by Frank Herbert.
I just saw the trailer for the new Dune movie at the Wonder Woman movie.
It's a big controversy right now whether that one's going to get released in the theaters or not. I did not see the old one with Sting. Did you see that one?
My dad always had it on, but I never paid attention to it.
Yeah, I mean, the book's amazing. It's really just an incredible work of art. But then he did what a lot of guys do, is write 50 sequels to it. And then I think his son began writing sequels to it. And so,
is Ender's Game, is that an older book?
I feel like it was 1990s, maybe,
okay.
1980s. Right. It's really good. I mean, it's way better than the movie.
Yeah.
But again, he beat the dead horse by writing 50 sequels that didn't need to exist. A couple other honorable mentions on the list that caught my eye. Number 69 was Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham. I read that when I was a kid. It was an excellent book. Day of the Triffids is great. Number 59 are the Wool books from 2012 by Hugh Howey. I read the first book and it was excellent. He's kind of like the first guy to have a bona fide hit in the self-publishing Kindle platform. The book's about people who live in an underground missile silo the size of a skyscraper underground, and they're forced to live there because of their belief that the air above the earth is poison. 35 is a book called Old Man's War by John Scalzi from 2005. I actually just picked this up last week at a library book sale for 25 cents. It looks excellent. I read the first 2 pages, and it's written in first person in a very conversational style that I tend to enjoy. I may need to seek permission from my boss at Paperback Warrior to review a book that's only 16 years old. What do you think, Eric?
We have no rules.
Permission granted?
Yeah.
All right, I'll give that a shot.
Yeah.
Number 32, I mentioned The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Robert Heinlein, so I feel vindicated for liking that book as much as I did because it made the top 100. 31 is Starship Troopers by Robert Heinlein. I'm told it's an excellent book and is nothing like the famous movie. Number 18 is The Martian by Andy Weir, which is one of my favorite books of all time. I read it the week he released it on the internet as an ebook, and I corresponded with Andy Weir, the author. He's a very approachable guy. This is even before he quit his day job to become an author, and long, long before The Martian movie was nominated for Best Picture. And so anyways, that's a bit about it for the list. Let's do some reviews. In an effort to be better rounded men of letters, I read 3 science fiction books that we can broadly define as pulp and reviewed them at paperbackwarrior.com. Now, you read and reviewed some science fiction books as well, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the first one I want to discuss is called Invasion from 2500. It's by Norman Edwards. It was released in August 1964 by Monarch Books. Now, Norman Edwards was a pseudonym utilized by science fiction authors Ted White and Terry Carr for their collaboration. It's a really short book. It's like 125 pages. It's also a $4 ebook under the author's own names. The book takes place in contemporary 1964 America. A Korean War veteran named Jack is driving through the desolate rolling hills of South Dakota, and the night sky illuminates with a flash. A arch forms in the sky, which has armored men and war machine begin emerging from this arch. The author's description actually matches the paperback, the cover of the paperback really nicely. I like it when that happens. It doesn't take long, only a couple pages, before this invading force of high-tech soldiers wearing gas masks takes over every large U.S. city, while most Americans are cowering in their homes. Meanwhile, Jack and a hitchhiker are trying to outrun the invaders. The reality concerning the identity of this invading force is pretty much given away in the paperback's title, Invaders from 2500. And which I thought was kind of a tactical mistake, because the origin of where these invaders were coming from was kind of like a big second half of the book revelation. These oppressors from the futures had these insidious plans for the good people of 1964 that I'm not going to give away. Fortunately, an underground resistance similar to what arose in France during World War II forms to oppose these invaders from 2500. I am a sucker for time travel stories, and if you are into cool time travel paradoxes, there's more than a few in this little paperback. I really liked Invaders from 2500. I thought it was simple, but actually very exciting. It was just a vintage, pulpy fun. It's also a great gateway drug into the world of science fiction for readers approaching the genre from a background of action-adventure pulp fiction. It has breakneck action from start to finish, merged with kind of cool time travel ideas, and it's a real winner. So again, I'll just reiterate, it's called Invasion from 2500 by Ted White and Terry Carr, writing under the pseudonym of Norman Edwards. Eric, go ahead and do one.
Okay, I'm choosing the 1968 novel Damnation Alley. It was authored by Roger Zelazny, a successful sci-fi and fantasy writer known mostly for his 10-book series Chronicles of Amber. Tom, I'd say a lot of our older listeners can remember the 1977 movie adaptation of Damnation Alley.
George Papard, right? The guy from the A-Team.
Yeah, and Airwolf's Jan Michael Vincent.
Nice.
But I saw the movie when I was a kid, and I thought it was great, but just recently I read the book in my 40s and thought it was just okay. The novel's set in the future after nuclear war has ravaged the Earth. There's still some law and order, but mostly the U.S. is now fragmented. In fact, California is its own nation at this point. This future Earth is a pretty scary place now. The atmosphere is this swirling belt of dust and garbage propelled by howling hurricane-strength winds. Because of this, air travel is impossible. And traveling by land is possible, but a cross-country trip would be like running a gauntlet of giant bats and insects, roving biker gangs, freak storms, and endless radiation. Thus, a trip from California to a city like Boston is deemed a Damnation Alley for a reason. Few people have lived to tell about it. The next guy to try the run is a former Hell's Angel biker named Hell Tanner. He's an anti-hero, and he's a killer. The nation of California makes Tanner a deal. If he can successfully drive from California to Boston to deliver this antivirus to the plagued city, the law will wipe his criminal record clean. Essentially, Tanner can become a free man if he can survive the trip. Tom, there's no doubt that Damnation Alley is an influential book, not only for science fiction, but as a huge catalyst for the post-apocalyptic culture. Just looking at the interview between Tanner and the cops on working out the deal to secure his freedom was obviously used by director John Carpenter for his Escape from New York movie. Just replace Hell Tanner with Carpenter's Snake Plissken. A lot of the men's action-adventure series that we have covered here at Paperback Warrior have similar ideas to Damnation Alley. Stuff like Outrider, The Last Ranger, Traveler all feature protagonists that use a signature vehicle to travel dangerous post-apocalyptic roads, either to find someone or something. In that respect, Damnation Alley is what I would think is an important book. Besides the legacy, I thought the book itself was a bit boring in places, as Hell Tanner mostly just drives, eats, and sleeps while he's driving across the country. The movie made this trip so much more exciting than what the author did with it. It's not a great book, but I'm glad I read it. I thought it would have been better, but Tom, it probably would have had a bigger impact on me if I read it upon its publication. My brain has been desensitized by all the post-apocalyptic culture, so the book isn't anything special now. But anyway, that was Damnation Alley by Roger Zelazny.
Sounds more groundbreaking and influential than actually good.
Yes.
Right? All right, so what I want to review next is called Corpus, Earthling by Louis Charbonneau. Louis Charbonneau is this highly regarded author of horror, western, and crime, and science fiction, and he had this knack for propulsive plotting and claustrophobic settings. My first exposure to his science fiction was this 1963 novel Corpus, Earthling, which was adapted into an episode of The Outer Limits in 1963, starring Robert Culp. The book has been reprinted by Oregon publisher Armchair Fiction. The narrator is this UCLA college professor named Paul Cameron, and he's hearing voices in his head. He first assumes that he's going nuts, but then it sounds like his mind is somehow intercepting a transmission of some kind. Now, it's nothing particularly coherent, mostly just sentence fragments and phrases without much context. But things get scary for Paul when he overhears a voice in his head declare, "Someone is listening." Is Paul the someone? If so, who's the speaker? Now, the bits and pieces Paul catches over the next few weeks make it clear that whoever is speaking is desperate to find and eliminate Paul for listening to a conversation he was never intended to hear. Now, see, it's the not-too-distant future where this book is set, and America is gearing up for its second manned mission to Mars. Both cover art variations of the paperback give away that the Martians are the hostile menace that Paul is intercepting. What's really neat is that science fiction has always had a bias toward alien invasions using gleaming spaceships, but this author had a different vision of hostile invaders, one arising from the tropes of horror fiction, demonic horror fiction, the idea of invasion through possession. When Paul's mind isn't being occupied with his interstellar eavesdropping, he's focused on his sexy new neighbor, Erica, and his seductive student, Lori. For a guy trying to save the world from a Martian invasion, he spends a lot of time in this novel trying to get laid. Now, I've never been in that position, so I probably shouldn't judge him, but it did seem like a very interesting sideline. So if you're familiar with the story structure of a typical 1960 crime noir novel, you're going to feel right at home with Corpus Earthling. The paperback has mystery, melodrama, non-graphic sex, action, a femme fatale, a religious cult, a manipulative foe. It's definitely drawing from a pulp fiction tradition as opposed to like an overly smart science fiction epic like Robert Heinlein or Frank Herbert. Overall, I really thought the short paperback Corpus Earthling was a lot of fun to read, and I recommend it. Again, it's Corpus Earthling by Louis Charbonneau. Eric, go ahead and do another.
Yeah, and you may disagree with this one, but I think it fits science fiction really well. And I'm not sure if we've touched on the series at all, so I'm going to talk about Deathlands, and I'm going to break the ice finally about this series and review the first book, Pilgrimage to Hell, originally published in 1986 by Gold Eagle. Listeners, if you aren't familiar with the series, it ran 138 installments and then spun off into another series called Outlanders, which ran another 75 books. Deathlands is what I would call a post-apocalyptic series, but it involves a lot of other stuff that you might find in something like Star Trek. The series was conceived by a UK author named Christopher Lauder, who also wrote for the likes of 2000 AD and The House of Hammer. Lauder wrote a portion of the series about Pilgrimage to Hell before giving the series to Lawrence James to write. The series is under the house name of James Axler, but the first book of the series is under the name Jack Adrian. Like the aforementioned Damnation Alley, Deathlands is set in a ravaged Earth that was decimated by a nuclear war in the far, far future of 2001. The Earth's geography now consists of hot and cold spots with the sky burning. Because of this, there's mutants, there's plagues, and there's death. But after explaining all of the events from 2001, the book advances to the year 2101, roughly 3 generations after the civilization that once was. The book's opening act is focused on a telepathic mutant named Kurt, who's assisting a group of bandits. They're attempting a journey north into a frosty wasteland known as the Darks, and it's here that a fabled treasure of supplies and wealth exists, yet no one has ever returned from this area safely. As soon as the group enter the area, they get tentacles and claws that emerge from the fog and seemingly kill off everyone. From that point, the book introduces the series' main character, who's a guy named Ryan Calder. He's part of this legendary group of traders that drive around in these huge tractor-trailer-styled armored convoys. Eventually, another series character named Christy is introduced, and she has her own telekinesis powers. There's also a guy named Doc that's introduced as a time-traveling cowboy from the 1800s. So these characters eventually fracture off from the trading convoy, and they join 5 others as they discover that there are stations all over the country that are called readouts. That's REDOUBTS. And Tom, these are like these teleportation stations that allow the characters to instantly jump all over the country without having to make a dangerous road trip.
Huh.
For instance, they can go inside one of these readouts and not ever know where the destination leads to. So in subsequent books, the characters enter readouts and end up in Louisiana, Alaska, the Midwest, and so forth. So it's like a mixture of all types of science fiction. There's fantasy feel, there's time travel feelings to it, there's post-apocalyptic overtones, and it has the whole beam me up Scotty idea of transporting to different locales where the author can build in this adventure. It's definitely more than just a post-apocalyptic series. I've read a handful of these books and mostly enjoyed them. The series is like a Dungeons & Dragons thing with obsessed fans that build RPG games from the series, as well as building models and dioramas of some of the vehicles and places. There was even an ill-conceived made-for-television film that aired on the Sci-Fi Channel. If you like science fiction, definitely check the series out. Again, the debut is Pilgrimage to Hell under house name Jack Adrian, but written by Christopher Loudert and Lawrence James.
I know the Deathland series has a very rabid Facebook following.
Yeah,
Every now and then we rerun your reviews of the books from that series on there, and they always have things to say about your reviews. I think the books also had a very successful second life as Brilliance audio books on CD.
They did, yeah.
Where they had like actual actors playing the parts of the characters. Anyway, so the last one I want to review today is called This Crowded Earth by Robert Bloch from 1958. You, the listener, know Robert Bloch as the author of Psycho, but he's actually a multi-genre talent, and he had several crime, suspense, and science fiction paperbacks as well. This Crowded Earth was a short novel from 1958 and originally appeared in Amazing Stories magazine, exploring the repercussions of rampant overpopulation in the dystopian future of 1997. It's always funny. Anyway, so there's a single man named Harry Collins, and he's only allotted a one-room apartment in a smothering, futuristic Chicago, which has a population now of 38 million people. Every sidewalk and elevator ride is a crushing mob of humanity. A simple commute to the office for a few miles is like a 2-hour ordeal. The overpopulation is caused by a lack of war and disease that has pushed American life expectancy well into the 90s, and there's a public policy decision that economically rewards couples for having children, as well as a lack of meaningful immigration restrictions, and all this further exacerbates this population explosion. Basically, everything sucks because there's people everywhere. So Bloch does this fantastic job of world building in the opening chapters while giving the reader the sense of claustrophobia also experienced by every single character in the book. So Harry has a nervous breakdown, and he gets sent to a government sanitarium, and this government sanitarium is really nice. There's plenty of living space, tons of green land, and woodsy trails to stroll. There's also this flirtatious nurse who seems to really dig our character here. It all just seems too good to be true. Harry's bubble is burst when he's visited on the asylum grounds by a mysterious stranger who shares the truth about his current living situation. I'm not going to give it away here, but nothing about this sanitarium facility is what it seems. This part of the book reminded me a little bit of Shutter Island by Dennis Lehane. Suffice to say that Harry's mental well-being is the last thing on anyone's mind on this campus. So there's this fantastically paranoid early novel twist that leads to a larger public policy prescription that is absolutely bonkers and would totally be offensive and politically incorrect to modern sensibilities. The politically incorrect solution to the overpopulation problem is so nuts, Eric, that even if I spoiled it for you, you wouldn't believe me. I wish Robert Bloch was still alive because I would really want to ask him if he meant this to be funny, but it's absolutely creative and totally audacious. It's clear that Robert Bloch was this man of ideas, and boy, oh boy, does he shoehorn a lot of ideas into this short novel. Many are harebrained, but others are really kind of interesting. The plot of this book fascinated me, but there wasn't a ton of action in it. If you're looking for a science fiction shoot-'em-up, this isn't the story for you. But I really like the heck out of this one. And it's also available now. You don't have to find the old pulp. It's available today as a paperback reprint from Armchair Fiction. It's interesting to read a science fiction novel from 60 years ago, predicting how awful the world would be 20 years ago. Right. I mean, we have our own unique problems today, but none are as dire as the fiction in This Crowded Earth, and that's a relief. Anything else from you?
That's it. That's all I've got.
Okay, well, so with that, these two science fiction dummies will probably just wrap up the show. So thank you for joining us on this journey into a genre we know very little about. And Eric, why don't you wrap us up?
This concludes the podcast for January 18th, 2021. Please join us next week for more laughs and tears and another discussion of musty old paperbacks. If you miss us between now and then, please visit us at paperbackwarrior.com, where we review old books every day. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and heck, even Pornhub to join the conversation. On behalf of Tom, this is Eric signing off.
Bye.